Forrest Gump lives in this weird space when it comes to American pop culture. The acting is widely considered to be fantastic, but its outlandish fantasy elements have dragged the film down over time. Two other legendary films also came out in 1994, The Shawshank Redemption and Pulp Fiction. While I personally think that Pulp Fiction is highly overrated, Frank Darabont's prison masterpiece easily holds up. It's consistently cited on pretty much everyone's top 10 list when people start talking about their favorite movies. All three films were nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars that year, and Forrest Gump would go on to take home the trophy. This left fans of the film having to defend it against two movies that are still considered to be classics. Personally, I couldn't possibly care any less which movie brings home a gold statue, and I'll continue to make fun of the Academy Awards until they bury me in the ground. That being the case, I will go to bat for Forrest Gump against whoever wants to complain about it. Fight me. Before we get started, click on that red subscribe button and the notification bell, that way you know whenever I post a new video. Director Robert Zemeckis is responsible for a handful of the most iconic films in movie history. The time-traveling comedy adventure Back to the Future? Zemeckis. The live-action animation crossover featuring an underappreciated performance from Bob Hoskins? That would be Who Framed Roger Rabbit? Zemeckis. That's not even to mention Flight, The Polar Express, Castaway, Contact, or What Lies Beneath. Zemeckis has had his fair share of clunkers too. Beowulf has aged very poorly, trust me, I watched it like a year ago, and Welcome to Marwen was a spectacular failure. The thing is, when Zemeckis makes a good movie, he makes a great movie. Having not seen the film in a decade, I came into my latest viewing with a healthy dose of skepticism. Is Tom Hanks' performance as awesome as I remember? Does the CGI hold up after all these years? Is Jenny still one of the worst people to ever appear in a movie? The answers are yes, yes, and yes. With the opening credits featuring a wayward feather finding its way to the feet of our hero, Forrest Gump almost immediately establishes itself as a fantasy film above everything else. While the characters, music, and setting are all very real, the movie clearly knows that many of the movie's plot points would probably never happen. Those fantasy elements are the thing that bothers a lot of people about this movie. It's goofy and fun, but also anchored in very real emotions. If you're unable to separate fact from fiction, I can understand why you would dislike Forrest Gump. If you can indulge yourself in this fictional real world, you're definitely in for a treat. Forrest Gump is a simple man. He functions slightly below the lowest tier of intelligence required to go to a public high school, something that characters readily point out from beginning to end. Words like imbecile, idiot, and stupid are peppered throughout the script. But there is much more to our protagonist than just that. While characters treat Forrest like he's stupid, our movie does anything but. It acknowledges his lack of intelligence and mental function, but gives us a man with far more depth than many other films would dare to do. After the opening credits, the film starts off with Forrest sitting on that iconic park bench in Savannah, Georgia. He's outgoing, friendly, and of course, painfully awkward. The setting provides us with a way to frame the story via flashbacks. We're shown his years as a young man, including his time as a shockingly effective kick return specialist on the Alabama football team. A large chunk of the film then moves to the Vietnam War. We follow Forrest's enlistment, friendships with Bubba and Lieutenant Dan Taylor, and his surprising turn as a war hero, aided by his ridiculous ability to basically run forever. Throughout the rest of the movie and Forrest's life, he finds himself observing or directly impacting numerous historical events. An unremarkable man finds himself in remarkable moment after remarkable moment. He gets a chance to meet Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. He teaches Elvis the famous leg shimmy dance. He's directly responsible for exposing the Watergate scandal. These are just a handful of small moments that provide us with some levity in what ultimately turns out to be a very sad, somber, and moving film. They also serve to wink at the audience and gently remind us that we are indeed engrossed in a fantasy world. Anchored by a phenomenal performance from Tom Hanks in the title role, Forrest Gump provides some of the best acting you will ever see. Gump appears to be a man who lacks both intelligence and emotions. While the former is true, the latter most certainly is not. Hanks holds Forrest's emotions just below the surface and then allows them to bubble up accordingly. This isn't a scenery chewing role. It's a shining example of an actor showing appropriate restraint, which is sometimes even more difficult. Robin Wright plays Jenny Curran, Forrest's childhood best friend and love of his life. Jenny grew up in an abusive home and sadly spends the vast majority of the film projecting her pain and misery directly onto her mentally handicapped friend. It goes without saying that Jenny is a fairly awful person. The internet has certainly done its best to make that case, with some pretty great memes on the subject. Jenny is a lost soul going from decade to decade and partaking in all of the sin and debauchery the human body can tolerate. The final 30 minutes of the film are complicated, as Jenny finally settles down with Forrest for good and introduces him to the son that Forrest never knew he had. And just like that, she's gone, taken by an unknown disease, leaving her son without a mother and her husband without a wife. It's a gut punch of an ending, saddling Forrest with a life of single fatherhood. So yeah, Jenny's pretty terrible, but Wright's portrayal is pitch perfect. Sally Field plays Forrest's mama, Miss Gump, to an absolute T. Her unconditional love for her handicapped son helps shape much of the early story, and she's a solid foundation for Forrest throughout the film. She's willing to do anything for her son, and as the movie points out early on, and to much good humor, anything means anything. Field is fantastic in this part, nailing the humor, compassion, ferociousness, and pride necessary to portray this loving mother. The movie does such a fantastic job establishing this relationship that when Miss Gump falls ill, we understand why Forrest immediately jumps off his fishing boat and just starts swimming towards the shore so he can go be by her side. Gary Sinise also gives the portrayal of a lifetime as Lieutenant Dan, a soldier who feels he's destined to die on the battlefield, but forms a lifelong friendship with Forrest. Lieutenant Dan, much like Jenny, devolves into a life of self-destructive behavior before ultimately finding redemption. His relationship with our protagonist turns out to be one of the highlights of the film as they fight together in Vietnam, hang out in the seediest parts of New York on New Year's Eve, and eventually go on to create the Bubba Gump Shrimp Company. Speaking of Bubba Gump, McKelty Williamson plays Benjamin Bubba Blue, Forrest's best friend in Vietnam. Bubba is another kind, simple man who loves shrimp, loves his family, and simply wants to do right in the world. He and Forrest are very much kindred spirits, and his tragic death on the battlefield is something that deeply impacts our hero throughout the rest of the movie. Forrest's decision to forge ahead with the shrimping company and donate Bubba's share to his family are all spawned by their unlikely friendship. When it comes to the technical aspects of Forrest Gump, the CGI works seamlessly and still holds up today. The removal of Lieutenant Dan's legs, the insertion of Forrest into various film reels, and all of the voice dubbing is rock solid and goes off without a hitch. The soundtrack runs the gamut from Bob Dylan to Fleetwood Mac to the Supremes and to Lynyrd Skynyrd, and is overall fantastic. Something that doesn't nearly get enough discussion is the score from Alan Silvestri, and holy cow, it's fan-freaking-tastic. You'll be hard-pressed to find a score that more delicately walks the line between sweeping and melancholy. It manages to be both moving and hopeful, and absolutely nails the emotional tone of the picture. Forrest Gump is a funny, touching, and deeply difficult picture to watch. It's the only movie that has one particular scene that makes me cry every single time I watch it. If you've seen the film, you've probably got a pretty good idea of what I'm talking about. There are those who will criticize Forrest Gump for being overly sappy or sentimental, and that's a fair criticism. I grew up with this movie, and to me, that criticism, those reasons that other people dislike this film, are kind of the reason that I adore it. It's unabashedly emotional and is crafted to make you feel very specific emotions. If you don't love it, that's fine. I'm just one of those people who does happen to love it. Thank you so much for watching the review. If you liked it, click on that red subscribe button down below. You can also like and share the video since that tells YouTube that the channel is worth watching. Also, sound off down in the comments about Forrest Gump, and I'll see you next Wednesday at 9 a.m.